We hope you enjoyed your meal and that you will not be quite sleepy now because there are many things to be tackled in the second session. Our topic for today is the contagion of revolutions versus resistance. The first intervention is by the well-known political writer Ruth Al-Hami, who maintained that we should not say a lot of things about him, but he's well known to you. He's speaking of the perspectives of repercussions of the Egyptian revolution on the surrounding area and the Palestinian context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to because I believe it would be better for the translation, for the translators, it would be better so they have the text in Arabic. It has become clear now that the year 2011 is the year of the first victories of the two revolutions of Tunisia and Egypt, and the year of the extension of the revolutionary movement, they ignited moving to other parts of the Arab region against the totalitarian and corrupt regimes, the regimes of subordination and subservience. It's clear that this year has become a prominent turning point in the history of region. While the Tunisian people is credited for igniting the spark of popular revolutions after it was able to overthrow the totalitarian regime in that country, still the quick movement of this spark to the large Egyptian arena and the prominent results which were achieved there, starting with overthrowing the heads of the regime, all those have moved the Tunisian phenomenon to become a large Arab phenomenon. And it has also shown that the process that has started in our region and still going on is a qualitative transformation from a certain historical era that was depicted by individuals or a group of limited people possessing or controlling the decision making and the wealth of the country with more or an increasing subordination to the foreigner, particularly to the United States, into a new historical era that is depicted first of all by a salient role for the peoples, the salient role of the people and restoring their decision regarding their destiny and future through establishing institutions and regimes that express their interests, aspirations, and willingness in development and achieving a certain degree of fairness and the distribution of the wealth of the country and shouldering the burdens of the construction era. What distinguishes what took place in Tunisia and Egypt from what happened in other Arab countries later are three main factors. The first factor is having the existence of a strong and developed civil society in both countries. I mean, the civil society is not meant by the NGOs that we know in our country. It is the parties, unions, and institutions that are independent from the state itself. So the existence of a strong and developed civil society in both countries, that all means of suppression and oppression over long decades of suppression and absentizing the democratic freedoms were not able to restrict its vitality and its active role. Two, the second factor, the two revolutions surprised the whole world without any exception. So the external influential forces which have their ambitions were not able to interfere early to affect the course of the two revolutions or to protect the two regimes, subordinate regimes in an early stage. The interference only took place only in a later stage of the revolutionary movement or after the elementary success they achieved achieved by overthrowing the heads of the two regimes. Three, in both countries, the army took a position of refrainment from interfering to suppress the popular movement. This was a full refrainment in the case of Tunisia, and a lack of enthusiasm to trespass certain limits in the case of Egypt, despite the fact that large sectors of both armies, due to their nature of formation, expressed great sympathy with the popular movement. And in the case of Egypt, even the army commands expressed early resentment from the patrimonial projects of the previous regimes. These three conditions, however, were not available on the same level in consequent popular movements witnessed by other countries, from Libya to Bahrain and from Yemen to Syria, which made the courses and consequences differ from one country to the other. No doubt that the success of the popular movement in popular revolution in Egypt is of a phenomenal significance due to the human size of Egypt and its geographical location in the heart of the Arab region and its modern central history, especially in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, in awakening the Arab regime and seeking to achieve a qualitative leap ahead in its internal conditions and a degree of independence from external influence. An evidence for this significance is the fact that some factors that formed the beginnings for the maturity of revolutionary conditions in Egypt, especially at the beginning of the century, were linked to surrounding Arab conditions, like the Second Palestinian Intifada, late 2000, and the American-British war against Iraq that started in the beginning of in the early 2003. This doesn't, however, mean at all that the main factors of the revolution were not basically internal factors linked to the deterioration of the living conditions of the majority of citizens and the proliferation of poverty and unemployment as a result of the neoliberal applications and waves of privatization and subjecting the public sector for sale and the wealth of the country for sale to external parties or to parasitic local capitalist sectors and the bureaucracy of the state, both of which were overlapped. All this is an atmosphere of aggravating plundering that accompanied all these operations, the smell of which were very much felt in the street and increased the indignation of large sectors of the people, which pushed the regime to more suppression to quell any popular movement or any sectoral demand movement in order to protect the interests of the ruling layer. Of course, now we don't expect some 20 months after removing the head of the old regime that all these problems will come to an end overnight or in a short term. That is because the concerned external forces and particularly but not exclusively the United States, which has great influence in the country since the Sadat regime, and the bargains that followed the October War of 1973, which was waged by the Egyptian army and the other Arab forces with a phenomenal bravery, will not really surrender easily to the loss of Egypt from its hands. Of course, the loss of Egypt, between brackets, they use this term. Because this will be probably an introduction for losing large areas of this region, as happened in Latin America in the last decade. It is known that Anwar Sadat had employed the results of 1973 war to hold the bargains with the United States and later with Israel, which practically led to wasting all the gains which could have been achieved by this war in relation to ending the Israeli occupation of all the Arab territories occupied in the War of June 1967, and achieving a rational degree of rights of the Palestinian people. This is something. These rights which Abdel Nasser was stick to until he was until his death. These achievements, military and moral achievements, were transformed through a short-sighted policy that sought to serve the interests of the ruling group or the ruling pharaoh to led to consolidating the results of the defeat of June by separating Egypt from the other Arab regimes and attaching it to the arms of the American-Israeli army. In fact, this was subjected to Abdel Nasser following 1967, but he refused it decisively. With this, the other Arab fronts were left alone, especially the Palestinian front, and put it under the mercy of Israel and its army and the balance of forces that Israel imposed with unlimited support from the United States for its expansionist and regional imperialist policies. All this took place under the banner of facing the Soviet Union and its allies in the Cold War, and this was the plan of Kissinger, and seeking to get Egypt out of that, and later considering Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union, considering Israel as a repertory of increasing importance in a region that is not stable, and in which the peoples of this region don't have any much affection to the United States and are not interested in protecting the monopolies of the Western monopolies in the region, and therefore the importance of the region has increased with the new discoveries of oil and gas and the increasing need of the industrial countries and even poor other countries for the energies, for the resources. Within this context, the upsurge of the resistance and the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in the 60s, and especially after 1967, were considered as swimming upstream, which means against the general trend of regression or retrogression of the independent Arab liberation movement. But despite that, important achievements were realized on the level of realizing or awakening the feelings of the Arabs and achieving an Arab and international recognition of the national rights of the Palestinian rights. But ousting Egypt from the conflict and confrontation with the Israeli occupiers in an early time following, and especially after the war of 1973, in a clear and well-textualized manner in the Camp David bargain of 1978 and the bilateral conventions between Israel and with Israel, and the aggravation of contradictions and internal conflicts and regional conflicts in the region and the Oriental region, from Lebanon to Iraq and Iran and the Gulf front, all weakened the interpretation of such Palestinian achievements into tangible gains on the ground, and especially as defined by the Palestinian national institutions and especially guaranteeing the rights of the displaced Palestinians. I can add to these two Arab and regional negative factors an important factor on international level that was not visible in the 70s and 80s, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern European bloc between 1989 and 1991, which aggravated the disbalance shifts in the balance of forces, international balance of forces, in favor of the Israeli-American alliance in the region, which resulted interferences, incursions, agreements that took place in light of this horrible disbalance of disbalance. What can we expect following the revolution of the 25th of January, the Egyptian Popular Revolution, is to have Egypt come back to its effective role based on the popular legitimate base, and not according to the characteristics of the historic individual leader, which the coup d'etat was aimed at getting rid of him. It is clear that getting rid of the people and the determination of the people and their concern for their own interests and rights is not so easy as getting rid of the individual regime or the regime of a group. And therefore, it is logical to expect a gradual return of the Egyptian role on the level of clinging to the Arab and Palestinian rights, not based on any ideological considerations and emotional charging only, but on the basis of joint interests and joint destiny among the peoples of the region that are overlapping geographically, and based on the aspiration to Egypt ridding itself from the chains of retrogression, surrender, and to the situation. And this is linked, the return is linked to the degree of development in the economic and societal situation, and ridding itself from the subordination chains, which will reflect on its regional and international political role. Within this context, and much was written about the degree of repugnance on the part of the Egyptian people against the policies of the Israeli state and policies of Israel against the Palestinian people and against Egypt, as well as repugnance and negative positions against the United States and its efforts to subjugate Egypt and to include Egypt to become subordinate within its general strategy, and to guarantee its control on the region and its wealth policy. Now let's mention a survey that was done by American foreign policy, some 4 months ago, which concluded that 85% of the surveyed Egyptians, look negatively at Israel, and 97% of them consider Israel as one of the major threats against Egypt, as well as 61% are willing to abrogate fully the peace agreement with Israel, and the rest wanted some modifications, and drew attention in this survey that the development of these rates over 1 year that preceded the survey itself, since the overthrowing of the head of the previous regime. For instance, the rate of those who wanted to abrogate the convention in last year among the university graduates has increased 18% to become 58%. And as well, the rate among youth who are under 30 years old have increased by 14% to become 64%. And it is therefore not strange, or rather, it is the importance of these two sectors is quite obvious for the future of Egypt in the long and on the short and long term. It is not strange that the reactions in Israel, though they are not clearly expressed for well understood considerations, that it is not strange that the responses in Israel were negative and worried, towards what is taking place in Egypt to a degree that made the Israeli foreign minister, whose tongue is unleashed sometimes, and expresses what his colleagues think of in the Israeli regime, and when he considered that what is taking place in Egypt is more dangerous than what is taking place in Iran. This is an open statement made by him. They mentioned magazine Foreign Policy also reported an ex-Israeli ambassador to Cairo, Tzvi Marzel, and on the eve of the presidential elections in May in Egypt, he said that whoever the president who's going to be elected, the feeling is what will come after that will not be good. Of course, he meant for Israel, not good for Israel. And the same atmosphere was expressed as well by by the ex-Israeli officer and minister who is among the leaders of the Labour Party, and he was born in Iraq, and he maintained a very strong relations with the overthrown Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. He said that the loss of Egypt or losing Egypt will be a big strike against us, and we have to prepare ourselves for the possibility of confrontation. It is not strange that the writer of this article that included these information, his name is Oren Kessler. I believe the name shows that he's a Jew and he might be an Israeli. That he gave a very expressive title for his article, calling it "Sleepless in Jerusalem." It is quite clear after witnessing the consequences of in the situation conditions some 13 years after the end of the entitlement of the end of the interim period mentioned in the Oslo agreement, and the continuation of feverish settlement expansion by the Israeli right wing, and especially in East Jerusalem and in most areas of the West Bank, and accompanied with a clear tendency on the part of the American administrations to be fully in support of the Israeli policies and protecting Israel in the international fora, and with the limited influence of the other international forces directly on the region. This makes the balance of forces related to the Palestinian situation doesn't allow getting out of this impasse by relying only on the local forces, which makes the developments in this region and especially in Egypt of a great importance. Pertaining to opening the possibilities for the salvation of the Palestinian people in a visible period of time, which means going back to the which doesn't mean going back to the previous era of waiting and depending on the Arab factor alone, and as well as relying on the Arab role surrounding that. That is relying the Arab role, that is not relying on the tendencies of the leading leader, but on the determination and willingness of and the will of the people who are the master of their own destiny in their country. Within this context, we can go back to restore some of the historical slogans that were raised in the course of struggle of the Palestinian people after 1948. So at that time, there was a slogan raised, which is "Unity is the way for unity is the way for liberation. The national pan-Arab nationalists raised this, and which expressed relying on the unity of the Arab armies in order to end the defeat that was inflicted on the Palestinian people, displacement inflicted on the Palestinian people in 1948. This slogan was met with a very difficult situation, manifested in the collapse of the experience of the unity between Egypt and Syria in 1961, and then the great Arab defeat in the 1967 and the consequence events which included a COP d'etat, political, economic, and strategic comprehensive COP d'etat that took place after the absence of Egypt, and which led to isolation Egypt from the arena of confrontation at the end of the 70s. From the other hand, in the early years of the Algerian National Revolution in the 50s, there was a slogan raised saying that liberation is the way for unity. Maybe our early brothers the Fatah movement remember this slogan, which was raised as a contradiction to the previous slogan. This slogan, however, has become consolidated and strengthened after the defeat of 1967 and after the Karama battle and the upsurging of the Palestinian resistance in the late 60s and early 70s. The literature of these early years bet on transforming the guerrilla war and the resistance into changing the resistance into a popular liberation war, and some groups call themselves as such, following the Vietnam example at that time. Through which the Arab peoples were awakened, there were attempts to awaken the Palestinian people in order to take part in the war, which has to end the injustices done against the Palestinian people. However, all these collided with the calculations and interests of the regimes and the existing formations in the countries of refuge in which the Palestinian resistance groups existed or established their bases in, regardless of talking about the calculations and interests of influential external forces. And later there has become more realism in dealing with the existing situation, and to shirk betting on awakening the Arab regime as a result of the Palestinian resistance. Now we can say without any illusions that the liberation movement of the Arab regimes currently going on, starting with Tunisia and Egypt, should push towards rectifying the previous trends and to link the destiny of the Palestinian people and the destiny of its liberation movement and its efforts to restore their national rights should be linked all with the destiny of the peoples in the region, especially those regions who are in the immediate sphere of the Palestinians, so that we can talk about the slogan of can raise that the liberation of people and their dignities are the way for liberation and unity, with the need to clarify that the liberation meant here is means the removal of injustices inflicted on Palestinian people, and so overcoming poverty, employment, unemployment, and awakening the economic and social situation, and ending the subordination chains of military subordination, economic and political subordination in Egypt and in other countries of the region, makes these people capable, makes these countries capable to effectively support the national liberation of the Arab peoples and especially their struggle to restore their sovereignty on their occupied lands and to restore their violated rights, which means particularly for the Palestinian people, which is meant particularly for the Palestinian people, which the national liberation process. National liberation process of the Arab liberation process cannot be awakened only by the Palestinian people, as the previous slogans in the 60s indicated, and the liberated or free. The free peoples whose responsible people are subjected to accountability and to their will and their aspirations are the people who are capable to achieve the historical duties and missions, including defeating the Zionist imperialistic project, expansionist project, and to restore the Palestinian rights and to achieve fully coordination, support among the Arab peoples. From this, we can say things, the developments in Egypt after years of long or short years of difficulties and impediments. And even despite some elapses and internal impediments or external devastation, this will reflect on the whole atmosphere in the region. And despite what could happen in the other Arab countries that are still witnessing revolutionary popular movements other than Egypt and Tunis. No matter what happens and no matter how long time will take with these movements, what these regimes should, or what all regimes should understand, that their historical era has come to an end, and the era of peoples and the freedom of peoples has started. In return, the external colonialist forces and their subordinate and satellite states in the region will continue to work in Egypt and other than Egypt to prevent this transformation and to prevent peoples from having their own sovereignty in their own land. These colonialist forces know well that they are dealing with free people that are defending the future of their countries. And this is more difficult, and the interests of these external forces cannot be guaranteed unless they respond positively to the interest of the region, in the region, based on what has been known at the end of last century, which is the balance of interests. This is the battle of the people of Egypt in the coming years, and the battle of the people of Palestine as well, and the peoples of the region, which who opted to break all the chains around them after they were in the period of subordination and surrender, has been ousted of history, as according to the title of a book written by one of the Arab intellectuals in the 80s. Now, the developments that we can see now, we can see that this ousted of was a temporary one, and the way is open now before the Arabs in order to return to history again and to take part in the process of the human history. Thank you.
Thank you. He has raised several questions. The paper has raised a lot of questions, but now we will listen to the other paper, and then we will have discussion after listening to the second paper. The second paper is delivered by Professor Aditya Nigam, and the title, The Arab Upsurge and the Viral Revolutions of Our Times. Professor Aditya is from India, and we know that we have a long-dated and well-established friendly relation with India. I would like to quote Mahatma Gandhi in the year 1938 about Palestine.
بيقول Palestine belongs to the Palestinian, to the Arabs, in the same sense. that England belongs to the English people, France to the French. What is going on in Palestine today cannot be justified by any moral code of conduct. واضح إنه إحنا عبر التاريخ علاقتنا مع الهند سبيشال، واليوم عندنا ضيفنا من الهند أديت أنيغم. He works in the broad field of social and political theory at the Center of the Study of Developing Societies. Adit Anigam is an active member of the India Campaign for Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. And we are proud of having him today.
I'm extremely happy to be here today, and I must profusely thank Muatin Maijayusi and Majid Shihade, who actually made our trip to Palestine possible. Since I do not belong to this region, obviously my reflections on the Arab Spring or the Arab revolutions are mediated through my own context and my own situation in India. And what I will offer to you are some reflections by way of understanding or trying to grapple with what seems to me to be a new situation emerging into view. A situation that perhaps, if one looks at the range of movements that have followed since the early uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, resonating across the indignados in Spain and Greece and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, and in the almost the same period, a very powerful anti-corruption movement, though much less sustained in that sense, in India. Two things seem to me to leap to one's view immediately. The first thing is what is an expressly anti-political positioning of many of these movements. In the case of the Arab Spring, I think the most of these movements, even if they don't directly position themselves as anti-politics, they definitely position themselves, or they definitely emerge from outside the bounds of the formal political domain. And what I'm going to suggest through my brief reflections in the next 10, 15, 20 minutes is that what we might be actually on the cusp of is a new kind of, we might be in the beginning of this search of a post-party democracy kind of situation. Unfortunately, much of our political and social theory, which goes without saying, Western social and political theory, does not really look at. There's been a lot of theorizing and talk about politics and the political, but what does not ever come into account in formal political theory is this institution of the party through which actually the business of modern politics has been conducted in the last 200 years. And I think what we are seeing in a manner of speaking here is perhaps a passing of that form. The second thing which I want to also briefly allude to is that unlike much of what was going on in the 20th century, where we were actually obsessed with totalities, with nation states and so on and so forth, and much of our imagination of politics was actually geared towards states do, the early decades or early years of the 21st century actually point us to another dimension or another aspect where politics seems to continuously escape the powerful states and nation states and their repressive apparatuses and so on and so forth. No doubt there is the new condition created by the explosion of the media and particularly the internet, but certainly there's something more to it. And we've been here for the last few days and we've been going around different parts of, we also spent a couple of days in Jerusalem. We've been going around Ramallah and various other parts here. And I'm sure it must be a very difficult struggle. I mean, we've all read about it, but it's nevertheless a shock when one actually sees things up front and experiences them. Nonetheless, I was struck by one thing which even though I hesitate to say it, I think I do want to say it, which is that going through large parts here and in Jerusalem, I somehow got the feeling that the Zionist project is a failed project. It is actually neither succeeding nor going to succeed. It is something which is already, things are slipping out of its hands. It doesn't seem to me, if even today, fortunately we were taken around parts of Jerusalem by a friend who lives there and who's actually shown us how even today after 40 years, 50 years, you have to take over room by room and settle people there. And nonetheless, it seems as if it is not something you can actually, even the all-powerful state does not really manage to accomplish. And one actually just has to imagine what happens if something like the powerful presence of the United States suddenly disappears one day, just like Soviet Union disappeared one day. What would happen to the configuration of power here? And so what I'm trying to actually say is that a lot of what I think and what I base my reflections on is on the sheer contingency of what constitutes politics, which is not determined by these large structures of power, large structures of the state, but actually through the sheer everydayness of life, where life takes its course in a way which continuously things seem to move out of the grasp of the powerful. And however powerful a center of power may be, a state may be, it is always surprised at the end of the day to see the unexpected quarters from which suddenly it can be faced with challenges which it never ever expected would happen. And I see something of that sort actually emerging into view, not just in the Arab Spring, not just in the Occupy Wall Street movements, but also in a number of other contexts, even in India. And I suppose perhaps also this might have something to say about the future of Zionism and the future of the Palestinian Liberation Project. Now, I do want to therefore focus on a couple of things which I think, talking also to a number of people over the last few days and people associated with the youth movement, the impression has certainly been strengthened that there is a move, dissatisfaction, a disgruntlement with, or disillusionment with the formal process of politics and party representation. And a lot of people actually said it in so many words that this looks like we don't feel represented, even through organizations which claim to be our representative organizations. So at that level, I think this whole post-party scenario is also linked in a certain sense to a certain kind of post-ideological moment, where in a post-ideological, at least in its 20th century sense, where we had very clear-cut ideas of what is left and what is right, what is Islamist and what is West, what is East and what is West, and so on and so forth. And it is not that left and right have ceased to matter, but they matter in a much more complex way, because we know that the left is not the same across all divides. I'm sure, I mean, the sense that I get, for example, of how the Israeli left behaves in critical situations often is not quite the way we thought in the 20th century a left or a international solidarity would work. So in that sense, it is not that these divisions are irrelevant, but certainly these divisions seem to now be mediated through much more complex other modes and forms. And how they pan out in the future is, of course, a question that remains to be seen. So it is in this context that I actually also want to touch on this question of formal politics, which in our context, from our context, I see as towards the last decade of the 20th century reaching a kind of stasis. In India, it is a period which is actually celebrated as a period of democratic upsurge, where lower orders and lower castes and their parties actually made a big impact in the formal political domain. And nonetheless, this is exactly the period of the last 20 years where the formal political process actually has ceased. There has been a cessation of politics within the formal political domain. So there's no more any politics in the political domain. In fact, all the political issues of any significance have been posed now from outside the domain of formal politics. And especially questions of poverty and redistribution have ceased to be posed from within that domain. If one looks at the overall picture of the West, we only have parties which increasingly look more and more like each other, and the number of options that are present before us, before ordinary people, obviously, it looks like there's not much to choose, for example, between a Labour and a Conservative, or a Democratic and a Republican Party. So if this is the condition of what is the formal domain of politics, what actually happens when an event like the Arab Spring occurs is, it seems to me that it takes away from the parties. And this is the classic 20th century phenomenon, where parties were actually serving the menu. There was already a certain degree of certain kinds of things available from which we, the people, had to make our choice. We could either choose this or that or that or that. But there wasn't really much we could do in terms of determining what would be the items on the menu. And what is crucially significant about this moment of the Arab Spring and this moment of the anti-corruption movement in India, or the moment of the Occupy Wall Street and the Indignados in Europe and the US, is precisely that the agenda is being set elsewhere, is precisely that the menu is now not given. It is the decision regarding the menu is not anymore given to the parties, whether they be of the right or the left, and that in a sense they are having to follow. So I'm not very sure what this means in terms of the future arrangements of politics, because as we've been hearing the discussion since the first session, it is quite clear that since we are living in a moment in an interregnum, when old forms are becoming passé and ineffective, and new forms have not yet emerged. And in this interim, the difficulties of the kind that, for example, were presented in George's lecture in the morning, where you have the same old organizations stepping into the breach and trying to capitalize on the energies generated by the mass movements. That kind of a classic scenario can obviously replay itself in this kind of an interregnum, which is what possibly forces upon us the urgent necessity of thinking out newer forms and different ways of continuing with the project which has been, in a way, brought into view by the Arab Spring. And here I would briefly also like to, therefore, refer to this entire question of popular sovereignty which came up in the morning. Of course, I do not have the competence to talk about the Palestinian situation, so I'm not going to talk about it in the Palestinian context. But it seems to me from our own Indian context and from the little that I can understand of the Arab revolutions of the last 1.5 years, 2 years, is that the centrality of the public square in a certain fashion, that the centrality of, and I think the reference to Hannah Arendt was made in the morning, and that whole idea of masses moving into collective action and the emergence of a new kind of power, which is quite evident all through the Arab Spring, all through the major episodes of the Arab Spring. And that certainly is a very crucial and important part of our of this contemporary experience. But the real problem is precisely the problem which in a sense faced Hannah Arendt when she was doing her explorations of the question of power, which is how beyond how to see or ensure the endurance of this new power beyond that fleeting moment of political action in the public square. And that fleeting moment of action, collective action at the public square, which has in fact a very spectacular dimension to it, we have seen also sort of dissipates the moment the immediate purpose is achieved. And once that happens and we return to our rhythms of everyday life, that is where the crucial challenge therefore emerges. Now in the Arendtian understanding or exposition, the idea of freedom itself was in the capacity to act politically. To be free was to act politically. To appear in the public square was freedom. But at the end of the 20th century, with the whole experience of the 200 years of party politics and the way in which popular will is repeatedly hijacked by this form of modern politics called the political party, the question is worth asking whether this whole idea of will and power and representation and so on, this whole paraphernalia that we have inherited from a certain dominant tradition of Western political theorization, does it really enable us to see those other kinds of, or other modes of politics that might be actually happening, which may in fact disavow formal processes of representation and will and so on. It seems to me, just to conclude in a couple of minutes, it seems to me that much of the experience of all these movements, which is at some level based on a dogged refusal to take power. Unlike many of the earlier revolutions, there is no vanguard, there is no program, there is no platform, there is no ideological position. And I understand when this question came up in the discussion in the earlier sessions that there was a certain lament about it, that there is no leadership and there is no program and that there is no platform and so on. But could it be the case that perhaps this is what opens out the possibilities for our future. Could it be that now that there is no vanguard, everybody is able to at least be part of the political movement or of the movement in precisely the same way as everybody else? And yet, and therefore, the thrust of these movements, it seems to me, is not that of taking over power or capturing power, which the desire for is there, and all of us seem to at some level feel that if we do not take power and it dissipates, there will be again some kind of a counter-revolution and so on, and that the positive achievements of the revolution will be dissipated. But my sense is that if one looks at the entire history of 20th century revolutions, the disaster was no less at some level, even after taking of power, and perhaps in political terms. It's not to say that the socialist revolutions did not achieve anything, that they certainly did. But in political terms, in terms of the question of dealing with the question of power, the socialist revolutions, it's in fact present a case itself to be studied where they turned out to be in fact worse despotisms sometimes than the despotisms that we see in liberal democracies. And so in that sense, perhaps this refusal to take power, and yet through a myriad ways keep those in power on their toes, keep those in power continuously subject to a possible ambush by